I'm going to give to Joanne to present his BRICS. Sorry.
Since I don't have a PowerPoint, I think you deserve to see my face, so I'll just stand here and you cannot. So I'll just stand here and communicate with you. So since Professor Gale has really went detail about the specific countries, I'll just generalize basically how the issue of the right of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa is important. I don't think the story will be complete without adding South Africa. A little bit peculiar case, but important as well. That thing needs to go off. Basically, my starting point is.
You're not using it. Okay. It's gonna go.
So, for as long as
It's gonna come back. Okay.
don't worry about it. I'll just stand here.
Okay. So it's gonna. That's good.
So, when we look at the history of human rights promotion, particularly after the Second World War and most importantly after the 1970s, for the production of knowledge about human rights, as well as its implementation has been influenced by the West, because the West had a monopoly over production of knowledge, and also it had this economic power over developing countries, because most of these developing countries, particularly in Africa, has a strong unilateral dependence on the West. The West could potentially influence their behavior towards human rights, and that comes the issue of this conditionality, attaching conditionality to economic aid, economic cooperation. And that's one of the reasons why, including myself and a lot of us, campaign to change the behavior of policymakers and diplomats in the West. I think the rise of BRICS, the rapid rise of the economy, the nature of the economy, and the kind of resources they need, as Isgail went deeper into, will really change how human rights will be performed in the long term. I hypothesize four main points that I think is happening right now and going to happen in the long run. One of them is that the rise of BRICS is creating an alternative source of funding for developing countries, reducing their dependency on the West and enabling them to be less responsive to Western pressure. What I mean by this is, if you look at how Ethiopia responds or any other countries respond, in the past, the West can just dry up the funding or even delay it for a few months and create crisis in these countries. Nowadays, what we are seeing is whenever the West brings the issue of human rights or changing policy, they can just turn into the East or threaten to turn into the East. Therefore, the West is losing a lot of leverage. And in Ethiopia, I think I'll go back later and look at it. In Ethiopia, what we are seeing is every time the US or the Western powers have mentioned the issue of human rights, Prime Minister Meles Zenawi comes down, talking about neoliberalism, talking about developmentalism, and announcing how much money they gain from China. And that is affecting how the power of the West on human rights. The second point is, say the West is declining and these are rising. Can they influence? Can they influence how the behavior of the Ethiopian government perform, or say the Ugandan government perform? Can India, with growing role in Africa and as a democratic country, can we appeal to India to use some conditionality to force our government to change or stop abusing human rights? I think that's not likely, because there is a mutual dependency. There is a mutual dependency between the West, between African countries and these growing economies. The growing economies have huge need for resources. If the African countries or one of the African countries changes its preference, if they decide to sell, say, to the West or to other countries, there might be problem for countries like China. Therefore, the Chinese or the Indians cannot be partners in human rights, because they cannot pressure, they cannot attach economic human rights promotion without incurring substantial economic loss. So they will definitely forego for their economic interests. The third hypothesis is that as these countries, even if they want to, even if these countries want to, say India might give you hope, or South Africa as a democratic country might give you hope, it might lobby in Mbeki or any of them, can they do it? There is a difficulty in this area. The difficulty is that neither China nor India or any of these countries have any substantial institutions that work on human rights. They don't have think tanks. The knowledge of human rights, the concern for human rights in their academia, in their society, especially human rights, I'm talking human rights internationally, is very low. Therefore, they cannot be they cannot be counted as a potential ally to help develop human rights, to help us promote human rights. Ideologically, also is important. These countries, the leadership in many of these countries are inward oriented. They are not that much outward oriented. When the idea, some people say China is an imperialist state, but they don't seem to have that much of the idea of dominating the world. And they have more of the idea of dominating the world economically, and they don't seem to care what kind of culture is practiced in Ethiopia or other places. So ideologically they are different from the West, so you cannot appeal to their ideology either. Fourth, within the international system, almost all these countries continue to favor state sovereignty rather than the so-called responsibility to protect. This is important because they attach this long-held belief in state sovereignty to their economic interest to frustrate any international effort aimed at pressuring governments to change their behavior. If you look at how they dealt with the issue of Libya, and particularly how they are dealing with Syria, they are blocking, effectively blocking any international intervention. And I think they will do the same in Ethiopia. So this foreign policy of favoring strong support for state sovereignty is, I think, frustrates responsibility to protect, say, on humanitarian ground or for protection of human rights. Now, when we bring all these four factors together, how would it will affect the Western's response? We have said that the economic growth the fast economic growth in these BRIC countries is creating alternative sources. The BRICS cannot be considered reliable forces for human rights protection, and they don't have the ideology or the institutions, and they favor state sovereignty. How is this going to affect, say, the response of the United States in the future? As the BRIC economies become increasingly competitive for resources in our countries, the West might not want to lose out in the competition by antagonizing the developing countries. Why? Because although for a long time the West cared much about securities and economies, they don't want these BRIC economies to dominate the global economy. Second, they want their companies to get access to the growing economies of the developing countries in Africa. Therefore, they might start, we are observing a shift towards this economy in relationship to Africa as opposed to more of a security and stability issues. So the US and the UK particularly are starting to hesitate on attaching conditionality to economic relations, and consequently they are reducing commitment toward this human rights promotion. Okay, now we are observing, let's say there are two powers that are competing, the West and these rising BRICS. If we compare this to the situation in Cold War, during the Cold War, what do we observe? One is, during the Cold War, the competition was largely based on security concerns. Security concerns dominated how the USSR supported Ethiopia or how the Americans supported Somalia and so on. Now we are observing a shift. What we are observing is that Chinese or the Indians are supporting governments not because they have much of a security concern in that area, because they have economic interests. And this affects how they will respond to the human rights crisis. The Russians used to stick to a regime as long as that regime is aligned with it ideologically. They used to stick to the last minute. They were supporting Mansour to the last minute. And what we are observing in China is they do cost-benefit analysis. When they see a government is going down, they tend to switch to the new emerging power because they're interested not on keeping, say, developmentalist state in Ethiopia or EPRDF in Ethiopia or whatsoever. What they're interested more is in making sure that whoever is in part one, if they can, they want to keep the existing government in power. If they cannot, they want to ensure that whoever is coming is under their dominance. So because of that, I think it will affect how we think of human rights, because during USSR, you have no hope of changing the Russian government's perspective. Now, you can, I think, change the Chinese government, not by appealing to them, but by making costly, very costly to support that government by reducing the influence of the state. On the bright side, that's where we're right now. On the bright side, most of the BRICS are known to be less ideological. The leadership is less ideological and more of economic when it comes to their foreign relations. Therefore, they tend to support a given region only as long as it tends to continue the flow of their economic interest. So, what are we observing in Ethiopia in the last at least 10 years is that there is a growing relationship, economic relationship, also political relationship with these countries. And the government is trying to pit the East against the East against the West, particularly after the 2005 election. There is a very hated attack on Western ideologies, on neoliberalism, as a way of, one, appeasing the Chinese, I think, and becoming closer to them. Second, as a warning the West that if you push us too far, we're going to go into the East. Just to mention a couple of a couple of the examples of how the Ethiopians are playing is when the Swedish started pushing for human rights. They announced the closure of the Ethiopian embassy in Sweden, and in the same day, and they justified it by saying, "Oh, we needed to open one in Brazil." It's a very interesting strategy, and I think that to some extent, to some level, has sent a signal to the West, and we are observing a shift in how the British and American foreign policy makers are, especially the diplomats, are responding to this. Two examples. One, not only are they losing impression on human rights, they are starting to justify human rights violations. Tim Clark, if I'm correct about his name, the head of the DFID, went as far as saying that the 2010 election, when the ruling party won 99.6 election, 99.6% of the vote, was normal or democratic by African standard. I thought that was a signal. And second, DFID is funding a number of researchers that try to justify the conglomerates. I don't know if you have seen them, where they are saying they are good for economic development, they allow the government to channel resources, allocate resources on areas that will energize the economy. And what we are seeing there is they are shifting. They are at the government of Ethiopia is pinching them in the face, saying that I'm going to go to the west, to the east. They are coming. They are not only stopping the pressure, but also they are coming to trying to appease them. And another example is the current American president, American ambassador. I'm almost done. The American ambassador, when he went there, he announced that the priority right now is development. We want to work with them with development. Based on my knowledge, the previous ambassadors and the previous policies were more about development, democracy, and peace. No more peace, no more democracy. Now they are more focused on development. And if you compare what the statements of the ambassador with the statement of the prime minister, they look like the same copy. That tells me that the West is making a significant shift. They are reducing pressure on human rights, for improvement of human rights. They are actually joining the government in justifying human rights repressions. So, if these are the conditions that are happening in Ethiopia, and how if the BRICS, the influence of BRICS is, as I discussed earlier, what do we expect and how should we approach the issue of human rights promotion? I think the rise of BRICS pretty much will kill, further reduce the role of, the role of external actors in helping human rights because of the factors I mentioned earlier. But there is a blessing in here. The blessing is the involvement of BRICS, in my view, will increase economic development in Africa, particularly improvement in technology, improvement in it will create jobs for a lot of people. So the middle class will grow, technological distribution will grow. What that will do is it will help grassroots movements to communicate better, to work better and be stronger. So the strategy, I think, for Oromos, for Ethiopians, everybody is, I think it's time. I think it is time to not wait for the West. I think the idea of lobbying the West, lobbying the Chinese to bring change in Ethiopia anywhere, I'm not really I don't see it in the future. It's going to go down. The Americans will be competing with China to get the favor from Africa. What we'll see is both of them putting human rights behind them. Any kind of lobbying is not going to cut it. But the best approach, in my view, is to make sure that any support they provide to our governments are not cost effective. There is no cost effective. How can we do that? If you weaken the Mullah government, if the Chinese see that Mullah is going to go down, they're going to side with you. So why waste your time lobbying the Washington, organizing political party in the West? You should focus in making sure that the endurance of the government runs very fast, that the people are rejecting the system. When you do that, I think the Chinese will start to switch in and provide you with whichever resources you need, as they are doing, as they did in Libya. So I just want to finish with that, and I think the rise of BRICS is something we're going to look at.